does a lot. Hypothalamus, I believe, is the size of an almond.
It's very small. Yes.
How does it know what time of the year it is and what time of the day or night it is?
The biological clock is basically a group of cells, neurons, that just fire in a cycle, and they're controlled by light. For the majority of people with cluster headache, what I said, sleep, seasonality, and also that an episode can stop. So there's also something dynamic in that way. There's not something broken that's broken forever. There's something that comes and goes. Yeah. And if we can understand how an episode stops, we can also use that in the treatment. Just the cluster headache is much more extreme. The autonomic symptoms are much more. The pain is extreme. And we have this restlessness, which is true in migraine at all. And then, what is also peculiar is that it's strong and sudden.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of MyClusters Beyond the Pain. This is our first edition of in-person, and if you're joining us for the first time, my name is Darshan. I suffer from cluster headaches, started in 2016, so getting close to a decade now. After a severe bout in 23, 24, I decided to start MyClusters, a cluster headache app and research platform. And like any millennial with a midlife crisis, I decided to start a podcast. Important disclaimer before we begin, we are hosting this video for informational purposes only. Even though the guests are healthcare, clinical research, preclinical research experts, they are not here in their official capacity. Consider their opinions as opinions and not any advice. It's definitely not medical advice. If you suspect a chronic headache disorder or any pain, please consult a headache specialist. Having said that, very excited to have Dr. Rolf Fronczek as today's guest. Quick introduction, Dr. Rolf Fronczek is a neurologist, somnologist, focusing on headache and sleep disorders, particularly hypothalamic disorders such as narcolepsy and cluster headaches. His scientific research is also aimed at these disorders, and he's involved in care and education. He is the coordinator of the Neurology Master Program, Kooschapen.
Yeah, but I just finished with that.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Not anymore.
So that's an update. And the half minor in neuroscience. And he's the chief editor of the journal, The Neurologist.
Which I also just stopped doing.
Okay. So congrats are in order.
Yeah.
And a member of the Beroepsbelangen Committee.
Which also just great. So,
okay.
Yeah. So I thought I need time for other stuff. So you always do things for a certain amount of years, and then a new challenge.
Nice. But
still cluster headache, that's still going on.
That's going on. But your current clinical work is in general neurology with a special focus on the treatment of headache and sleep disorders.
That's correct.
Your specific expertise, of course, is in cluster headaches, including neuromodulatory treatment.
Yes.
And you work with the Sleep-Wake Center in Sine.
That's correct.
Okay. His current research focuses on the causes and new treatments of cluster headache and narcolepsy. Since the hypothalamus plays a role in both disorders, he is also co-authored 176 plus papers.
That's enough.
Leads the cluster headache research team at the LUMC, which is renowned globally as one of the leading research groups on cluster headaches. Anything I missed out?
That's already a lot.
And you're on the special interest group of cluster headaches, of
yes.
course, with the International Headache Society. So we have a cluster headache expert today. But first of all, before anything, how did you get into cluster headaches? Like, why cluster headache? What is it about the disease that drew you into it in the beginning?
It's a good question. Part of it is like many things, coincidence, how life goes. Because I started out during my medical school that I wanted to do research. I wanted to do something extra. I wanted to do something with consciousness. And then I ended up with sleep, because you always have to study a disorder, a disease when you're in an academic hospital. That became narcolepsy. And then narcolepsy, I did my PhD in narcolepsy, partly here in the LUMC in Leiden, but also in the Netherlands Brain Bank in Amsterdam. So it was a combination of laboratory work with brain sections, pipettes, and checking under the microscope, combined with clinical studies. And then when I finished, I still had to do my neurology training. And then this is a big headache center, of course. So part of the neurology training, we all do headache. And I saw many people with cluster headache, but then I didn't know this would be my future. It's just one of the things I did. But I was fascinated then already, because I noticed the link with sleep. And because people, when you read a review paper about cluster headache or you listen to talks, people often say it's caused by the hypothalamus. And I thought, is that how? Oh, that's interesting, because I'm also studying the hypothalamus. So I already got interested. And then when I was very lucky that I could get this position here at the LUMC combined with the position in the sleep center, it made sense to me to also study then sleep in cluster headache, because there was the link between the two sides. And I thought, well, so this should be studied. Like, why? We'll talk about this later. I think about what's the relationship with sleep and cluster headache. And I also knew many treatments based upon sleep from narcolepsy. And I thought maybe they will also work for cluster headache. So that's how I stumbled upon cluster headache and how I tried to combine my job here in the headache center and the neurology department with my job in the sleep center, to be honest, to find the common ground.
That's as you are. I have 7 follow-up questions just on the sleep part. But you are also a somnologist.
Yeah.
What does a somnologist do, and how do you think? You said you also mentioned there's commonalities with the involvement of the hypothalamus, of course, but also the involvement definitely in the circadian rhythm disruption in cluster headache patients. So
there are different questions. What is a somnologist? A somnologist means a sleep neurologist, you might say, but you can also become a neurologist if you're a psychiatrist or pulmonary doctor, or there are different ways to become a somnologist, psychiatrist, but also a neurologist. And it's like an extra specialty. So after you specialize into one of these different kinds, you can do an extra specialty through the European Sleep Research Society, and you can do an exam, you can do all kinds of things, and then you become a somnologist. And basically there's an extra stamp you have that you can treat sleep patients, and you can work in a sleep center. So I combine that with the general neurology, but also very specific sleep care it's called Sein in Heemstede. There's a sleep center near here. And then the next question, like, how is it all related? That's a tough question. Basically, to make it very simple, or it's never simple, but the hypothalamus is a piece of our brain, part of our brain. Is if you would go through your nose, the first things you would see in the brain then is your hypothalamus behind here. There are 2 halves, left and a right one. And below the hypothalamus, the pituitary is hanging there. It's a very old, ancient part of the brain, you might say. Many animals with brains do have a hypothalamus. And all the things that go automatically in your body are arranged there. Sex hormones, appetite, autonomic nervous system, body temperature, but also the biological clock, sleep, and maybe other things that I'm forgetting now. So many of the things that you don't consciously do, they are controlled by the hypothalamus. So 2 major parts are involved in sleep and the clock. And because in narcolepsy, we know that there's something wrong in the hypothalamus. So the sleep center is actually damaged. It's something you can also measure. That's when you get to disease narcolepsy. Because of this disorder, we learned a lot about how sleep actually works in the hypothalamus. So the pathways, the neurotransmitters, the neurons, so everything, how it works there. So that we learned in the last decades. And for cluster headache, people point towards the hypothalamus because the attacks often strike at certain clock times, or linked to the biological clock. Also, they are linked to sleep, falling asleep, maybe aspects of sleep. Again, it points towards the hypothalamus. And you also have this strange seasonality that it comes in certain seasons. And also part of this basic, how does the brain know in what season we are? Probably that's also part of what the hypothalamus senses. And there are some older imaging studies. So abnormal signals were found in cluster headache in the hypothalamus. And some hormone rhythms were maybe changed. And that's also controlled by the hypothalamus. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that the hypothalamus might be very much involved. And some people even say a key player. But in my opinion, the real proof of that and what is actually wrong there, nobody knows yet. But it's a good point to start because we don't know what causes cluster headache, and this is at least a point to start.
It does a lot. Hypothalamus, I believe, is the size of an almond.
It's small. Yes.
How does it know what time of the year it is and what time of the day or night it is?
The biological clock is basically a group of cells, neurons, that just fire in a cycle, and they're controlled by light. Melatonin is one of the things people know. If you see light suppresses the melatonin signal, melatonin is created in another part of the brain, then there are receptors for melatonin in the hypothalamus, like this loop. So with the day, light, and darkness, the clock is entrained every day, and that's just a cycle of a group of neurons firing in a cycle. So that's basically, and this whole mechanism of how this works is now more or less known. The molecules and the gene, that even the Nobel Prize was awarded for this work.
Okay.
To find out how this worked. So, but of course the hypothalamus is really complex. Many different groups of neurons, they all look different, have different markers if you try to visualize them. And much of it is also not known, but a lot of it is known. The stress system. There are many things that are in the hypothalamus. And indeed, it's very small. If you consider what it does, that's true. But it's also so tiny and small that if you really want to study the hypothalamus, it's not so easy. With a scan, you cannot just scan every minor part. You just measure the hypothalamus. This intrinsic machinery in there, how it exactly works, that's most often that is done in animal studies. If it's done in humans at all, it's mostly after people die and the brain is studied. That's what happens in the Netherlands brain bank places.
So because it's so deep and it's
small and it's in our brain, it's not easy to measure what's happening there.
And this is with MRI, PET scan, nothing. Is there any machine that's coming up that you think like a strong 7 Tesla MRI?
But it's also, what I understand from the 7 Tesla experts, also a part of the brain where there's a lot of bone and structures around it. So even if you go for a higher Tesla, it's still very difficult to actually visualize it very well. But things are improving, and who knows?
And with the brain bank, is it possible that someone who is deceased, that you can still, like post-action, still find something? Do you think then it's...
That's a good question. That's actually one of the projects we're now doing together with colleagues from London, King's. Yeah, we have a few cases, and I'm always very grateful, and I find it really special that people donate their brain, and then if you die, in the Netherlands at least, the brain gets taken to a central location. For many disorders this happens. In the past, and I checked it years and years ago, there was not a lot of cluster headache, but now there were a few cases of cluster headache, and we're actually studying them now. It's just started, the project. But mostly when you live a normal life, the cluster headache also disappears.
Right.
It's a part of your life where you have the cluster headache, and we think, and we also, lots of, again, circumstantial evidence that probably it stops again. And then the question is, can you still, after all these years later, when you study the brain, can you still find what caused the cluster headache all this time before? So it's a very, it's one of the things we're pursuing, but it's not easy.
Assuming that the starting point is from the hypothalamus, or that the disruption is not an effect of the disease.
That's also a possibility, which is also very reasonable. That's true.
So with living beings, like with us that have cluster headache, so I imagine in remission, which most of us, 85% of cluster heads are, then our MRI would look normal.
Yes.
Okay, but if we then are under attack, then you can't see anything because the hypothalamus is covered with bones.
Yeah, and some things were found, some altered signals during inbound, but then it's like an enlargement of one part of the hypothalamus, which contains many things. The resolution is not so high yet to really pinpoint towards specific parts of the hypothalamus at the moment in these older studies.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? So this is something with the central involvement of the hypothalamus that then presents in the trigeminal nerve, but then a block to the greater occipital nerve works. How do these interact in our brain?
You tell me. That's the big question, of course. We think cluster headache, the origin of the attacks happens in the brain. That's the theory. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that many people would consider it comes from the brain and not from a muscle, not from a neck.
And it's not vascular?
It's part in the mechanisms. I think the blood vessels play a role. But there's another hypothesis. There's another hypothesis that it's caused blood vessels, maybe there's some older hypothesis. But that wouldn't explain the sleep, clock, seasonality. It's very difficult to explain that if you only look at blood vessels. But they will play a role, probably, because we also know that attacks can be triggered by a radioactive compound. But I can't remember what your question actually was. But
what's the relationship between these organs, nerve systems?
This is just one theory and hypothesis that the hypothalamus is the key player. I'm open to other explanations, of course, but at least we know that the disease behaves like for the majority of people with cluster headache. But I said, clock, sleep, seasonality, and also that an episode can stop. So there's also something dynamic in that way. There's not something broken that's broken forever. There's something that comes and goes. And if we can understand how an episode stops, maybe we can also use that in the treatment. So maybe we can find out how the seasons affect the attacks. Maybe we can artificially induce a stop, but that's all for the future. And what we can do and what we are doing now is studying the signals that are a consequence of what happens in the hypothalamus. Like I said, the hypothalamus controls many things, amongst others, body temperature, and that you can measure. So you can measure the output signals, you might say. So you can measure hormones, like cortisol, stress hormone, melatonin, clock hormone, body temperature, which is also clock. And you can measure sleep, So we can measure the functions of the hypothalamus indirectly, and that's the way that you can do in live people that walk around and have attacks or have an episode or outside an episode. That's one of the projects we're doing.
That's the siesta
That's
study,
the
of
siesta
course.
study, yes.
And the idea is you track as a baseline people that are in remission and the onset of the bout, and like you said, the sleep hormone, body temperature, other biomarkers, and then what goes out. That sounds exciting. Going back to the topic of sleep, though. So, of course, you see patients as well.
Yeah.
Does your understanding of sleep give you different perspectives on treating cluster headache patients?
That's a good question. But yeah, if you have, there are two theories. Again, always if you talk to a scientist, I'm trying to be nuanced. Some say the attacks disturb sleep. So sleep is disturbed because of the attacks. People say no, sleep itself is disturbed because of cluster headache. Some people, even when they don't have the attack, they can still wake up at the moments when they used to have the attacks, or some abnormalities in the sleep have been found in bout versus out of bout, not very strong and clearly. And also in the past, we didn't mention that, if you look at the older literature, they say attacks are linked to REM sleep, REM, rapid eye movement sleep, that's the dream sleep. And when you go to bed at night, you fall asleep, it takes 1.5 or 2 hours before you have REM sleep, your first dream. And then often that's also the moment where the first attack strikes. Some people in the past said it's REM sleep. But now some Scandinavian studies have clearly showed the attacks can come from each sleep state, not only from REM sleep. So it's not as simple, it's just REM sleep. So in a way, my knowledge about sleep doesn't help me a lot, to be honest, when I speak to patients, because I still treat the cluster headache following the means we have, and the medication and the oxygen or the nerve blocks or neuromodulation. It's not aimed at sleep yet. And we know that if you give the regular sleep medication, people will still wake up from the attacks. I do have plans. That's one of the projects I want to do, is by using a treatment that we know from narcolepsy, affects sleep at night, to also try that treatment in cluster headache. That's an upcoming project, and I will discuss that later. It's still work in progress. But so in that way, I use my knowledge about sleep more for science and to study cluster headache and sleep, and maybe in the future for treatment. If people expect from me, oh, you also know a lot about sleep, so you can now help me sleep better when you have cluster headache, that's very difficult if you still have attacks. It's not something that I have a special secret trick for. But sometimes when they have other sleep problems, like insomnia, apart from the cluster headache, of course, we can treat that in a sleep center. But in general, if you take a sleep pill, you still wake up from your cluster headache attacks. It's not a solution.
I was just about to ask you, like, I have been, for other conditions, been prescribed oxazepam, for example, which I don't like using anyway, but would it be, or people take melatonin before
That's
going
an
to
interesting
sleep?
one, melatonin, because that has been raised as an option for cluster headache, older studies, and also some work, a scientific poster from people in London, that in a high dose, because our body makes melatonin, our body can do this. So also if you have light, darkness, your body can make melatonin. And then when you take pills, what some people do, you have very low dose pills, like 0.3 milligrams, which we use sometimes in a sleep clinic, but it's also debated.
Yeah.
But it's really low dose, because otherwise you flood the system with melatonin. If you take 1, 3, or 5, or 10, or 15 milligrams, which you can buy, it's like overload. But in cluster headache, this has been mentioned as a possible solution, like taking really high dose, higher than you would normally go. In my hands, it never worked. But some people say in their hands it did work for patients. So maybe, I don't know. So I don't know if it's really a good solution, but that's not the same as a benzo. Oxazepam, what you mentioned, or benzodiazepines, they also affect sleep itself. You have a different EEG signal, a different sleep pattern, and it doesn't improve your sleep. Especially not when you use it every night. It's also in all the guidelines to not use them if you have insomnia. It's only for short time of incidental use. So even for cluster headache, at least the patients that I know that still tried it, they still wake up from the attacks. I don't know stories of people that said, oh, then I didn't have any attacks, especially not chronically. But I don't know if you have another experience.
So you can't, I didn't take it to begin with, because there are other problems with benzos, because then you build up a tolerance, and
they're
then
also
it's
addictive and intolerance indeed. So it's not, I wouldn't advise it for cluster headache.
And I believe I've heard, I think you've mentioned it, I'm not sure, but that people with cluster headaches have riskier attitudes.
That's a different topic to do it in a nuanced way.
Yeah.
But in general, there's this personality type that's associated to cluster headache. But it's just very general, because not all patients are like that.
Yeah,
of course, everyone is different. Of course, the sex difference is clear, more in male than in female.
That's improving though, that's...
I don't know if it's improvement or at least it's more...
From a gender disbalance point of view, yeah.
And so it's becoming more common in women. Or the ratio is shifting more towards 4 to 1. When I started, it was 4 to 1. Now it's more 2 to 1. It can be because smoking behavior can play a part. That's one theory.
Is that a correlation, or do you think it's causation? Because
I don't know. In the genetic studies, causation is suggestive.
Okay.
Yeah, and many people with cluster headache smoke. Also many, like how we just started this train of thought, you have used drugs, illicit also before they had cluster headache.
Yeah.
But there's an association with smoking or creative drug use.
Okay.
And also maybe later to try to treat their attacks. This relation is there. But the question is, of course, is that shared genes, or is it because of the cluster headache that you turn towards this? But it doesn't really explain why also before cluster headache. So is there a certain personality type? That's the question.
Yeah, or is there something like with migraineurs, they said chocolate was a trigger, but then is there something in the body that makes you want to crave chocolate?
Yeah.
But I think that's a
But I don't
different
know if
topic.
they're more prone to addiction. That I don't know. Like what you suggested, that you want to be careful with benzos because people with cluster headache are more prone to addiction. I don't know if that's true.
No, that's just me. That's not to do with cluster headaches.
Okay.
I think that was more with, like you said, with other habits or with risky behavior. That's also, it's more of a personality thing, not related to cluster headaches. But it was just a curiosity that is there a sedative, so to speak, that can make you sleep through the pain? But it seems like it's a no. Plus, there are, of course, other risks as well.
There are many risks with sedatives, of course. And you also have tolerance addiction, and it's not the best solution to try to treat cluster headache like that, maybe. But as I said, we're working on something with sleep. Let's see how it works. But first, we want to finish this current study where we try to assess these patterns and how the attacks are linked to these patterns.
Absolutely. And if any one of you are considering, then don't do it. Again, this is not medical advice, but if you want to take any prescription drugs for other use cases or drugs that are not prescribed, please be careful. Going back to sleep, I think it's so central, at least when I look back at my journey, that I was at the worst period getting 3 nighttime attacks to a point where I didn't want to keep a cylinder in my bedroom because then I would have a tendency to fall asleep with it. So then I would wake up, go to the living room until the sleep itself got so disturbed. And there's something you said earlier that even after the bout ended, the sleep pattern doesn't come back to normal. So one, there is the disturbance or you build up a habit. Second, there is the anxiety around falling asleep and being woken up. It really took me, I think, without no sedatives, no drugs, but it took me about 6 months with a sleep coach, with a sleep hygiene. And something that I learned there was, so sleep in our body, is there something like sleep pressure that builds up through the day? And it's usually in 90 minutes cycles. Again, correct me wherever I'm wrong. And this is what builds up through the day, and then this makes us fall asleep at night. And combining what you said earlier about the hypothalamus, and then so the signals then combine with the sleep pressure, and something is disturbed in cluster headaches. But the attacks also come at night, so we can't sleep.
Yeah.
I don't know, do you have any tips, tricks to manage this? Like, how do you manage not being able to sleep? And then sometimes I've had cycles where naps would help. I've had cycles where naps are a trigger. Last cycle, when I really had to attend a concert, I took a nap before to trigger an attack. I could escape.
Interesting. Okay.
Maybe a 2-part question. How does one manage sleep, coping mechanism, tips and tricks during attacks? So for all the chronic people there and for episodics in bout.
Yeah.
And the second part of it, when not in a bout, are there some sleep habits, techniques that we can, and given everything else, so given the anxiety, are there things that we can strive to follow?
Yeah. The most simple thing is, in Dutch, is rust, reinheid, regelmaat. So it's like, what is it in English? Like fixed bedtimes. It's
Yeah.
not so nice. We know that in general, if you do have cluster headache attacks, so in chronic or in bout, that if you have alternating sleep patterns, shift work or jet lag, can trigger more attacks. At least that's what I hear often. So then it makes sense that the advice would be to not do that, to
Yeah.
have fixed bedtimes. But that's not always easy. And normally, in general, if people have insomnia complaints and then we tell them don't sleep during the day, exactly for that. So to build up your sleep pressure, so you sleep at night. If you don't sleep enough at night and you start sleeping during the day, your whole rhythm will be messed up. But that's difficult if you wake up because of the attacks. You do need your sleep later. So it's not. And we also say that if you do a nap during the day, do it short. Power nap, so 15 to 20 minutes and not an hour or 2 hours, because then you do a full cycle and it subtracts from your sleep pressure.
Okay.
So, all taking this all together, like outside of bouts, if you don't have attacks, I would say, and you have problems initiating, continuing night sleep, and then fixed bedtimes, only very brief power naps during the day, and do them at all, and try not to worry about it.
Okay.
But that's easier said than done. I realize this. And if there's a hypothalamic disturbance because of the episode, then it's there anyway, whatever you do. So that also makes it difficult. But we are not sure about this yet. So is it the anxiety and is it your own behavior, or is it really still the episode that messes up your sleep? That's the question. But in general, if you have sleep complaints, there's a sleep hygiene, we have the sleep coaches like you had, and most of these things that are mentioned are very simple things that you can also think about yourself, but still it helps if you do it in a structured way.
Do you think the sleep hygiene in a remission period has some effect of maybe prolonging the remission, or?
I'm not sure at all. That is a thing that nobody ever studied. So I wouldn't dare to say maybe the episode will come anyway, however you behave at your sleep. I don't know if you can trigger an episode by jet lag or by shift work or by sleep deprivation. I'm not sure.
Anecdotally, of course, I think there are many examples, but again, you can't make
That's an
conclusions.
interesting question.
My mind started exactly 3 days when I went to India in the summer last year.
Yeah.
That was the third night when I switched to the Indian time
But it
zone.
can also be the day of hours of daylight. It can be the air pressure or the temperature.
Exactly. So which brings me to the point of there are, I don't know if like studies or hypotheses that the amount of daylight exposure or let's say near the equator, that where it's almost 6 to 6 p.m. versus let's say in the northern hemisphere where we are, where you have the rate of change of light that is much faster during spring and autumn, can also have an adverse effect. Should we all move to the equator?
And that's a question I sometimes get. Can you make a prescription that it can move to a tropical country?
Yeah.
But there are different studies, and if you combine them all, the further away from the equator, the more seasonality, which makes sense because there's seasonality, and if you're at the equator, there's not. Also, like when cluster headache bouts occur, like the further from the equator, the clearly you see this yearly pattern. And especially the Scandinavian studies are quite convincing. And they also show a relationship with daylight hours. But of course, it doesn't prove causality, just a relationship with the amount of daylight, but it can also be the temperature, again, the air pressure, the light itself, who knows. But this correlation is there mainly in Scandinavian countries. Also, when we look at our Dutch database, where we have for the neuromodulation studies, we have lots of electronic diaries for years. And if you then plot them all together, you see the seasonality, even in chronic. So it's there. If the attacks would improve, or if the disease would be improved by moving to the equator, I only know anecdotes from people with cluster headache that move to the Dutch Antilles, for example, or they go there every winter because they say, then my cluster headache is really better. But of course, this has never been studied in a large group in a clear scientific way. It's just anecdotes from people. And also, the question is the prevalence of the disorder. Is it better or worse closer to the equator? But in many of these African countries, the prevalence has never been studied really well. So it looks like it's lower, maybe because we just don't know these cases, because they just wander around without having a diagnosis or a doctor to treat them. But I'm always interested in hearing these stories from patients. But there are also people that tell me, it doesn't matter, even if I move there, I still have the attacks. So it's not for everyone.
No, I can attest to that. I sometimes think I should make a map and see where I've had attacks, which would then include Brazil, Sri Lanka, India, and like of course the Netherlands, Portugal. So it's all over the map. But again, I think that's a good point about the study of prevalence. Maybe Indonesia is a good population to study because it's the equator, higher smoking population. I think I heard sometime that they have a lower prevalence, but then again, you don't know how many of them have not been diagnosed.
Exactly.
So lights with the Philips, the lights that mimic sunlight, is there any?
There was this study from Scandinavia where they looked at biorhythms or about clock rhythms in cluster headache. Very complicated study with lots of graphs and figures that the chronic and episodic is different and all circadian aspects. And then I expected them to do the study with light because they suggested, but I don't know if they did it. Anyone did it? I also don't know many people with cluster headache that use these lights. So I'm happy to hear stories if people have a story, but it's also not a plan we have, to be honest. I also can't imagine it's so simple. Just put people behind a lamp and then the cluster headache will improve. But no, I don't know if anyone really tried this. Sure.
Yeah, then it's going to, you'd essentially have to fool the hypothalamus.
Yeah, but then you suppress them. Yeah, I don't know. That's I think the whole theory.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe there could be some glasses, or you hear of these technologies that are being made for like to increase focus when you're working.
Yeah, there are many of these things,
table
like
lamps and
flashing lights, like lamps. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's good for your rhythm anyway to have lights during the day and darkness, and also in the evening that the darkness comes before you actually want to go to bed. Go into your bed, then switch off the light. You suppress your melatonin signal all the time, and then you turn off the light. Or if you use a screen, of course, it's well known, the whole screen problem. So it's better to 1 or 2 hours before you actually want to go to bed that the light's already dimming. Melatonin signal can come up, and even losing a little bit of body heat, working out, or hot shower, or warm drink. Not straight before going to bed, 1 hour or 1.5 before going to bed can help you ease into sleep. These are all these tricks in general for sleep, not specific for cluster headache. But yeah, I do think that if you have the bouts, you have the attacks, you can be like a holy saint and do all these things perfectly. You still will have your attacks, I'm afraid. And the power of these attacks and the whole thing that happens, the whole activation of this trigeminal vascular system, the whole pathway of the pain attacks where the blood vessels do play a role and the nerves and things. It's so powerful that I wonder, I don't know if you can, with all then you can still go to bed and turn off the light or turn it on to, the attack will come, I think. But I'm not sure, of course.
I just think, of course, I think none of these, or not none, maybe these are hard to do when with attacks, and of course, because then there's that additional medication, and then
if you treat patients and the attacks stop, then also they are improved, they will sleep better. The key is still treating the attacks.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think as much as I've tried to fix the sleep regimen when not in bout, when the attacks start, then it's the attacks themselves, but you're having that much more coffee, and then it's just sleep when you can. All right, now to a section that, again, let's say for someone that doesn't know what cluster headaches are, whether it's someone that's newly suspecting, newly diagnosed, maybe a healthcare professional. So this, of course, may sound, some of them may be like for the 1,000th time that you've answered. But this section, let's start easy. What is a headache? Why do we get headaches?
You say, well, let's start easy. Actually, a lot of it is unknown.
Okay.
But we do assume, like in migraine and cluster headache, because there are many headaches, migraine, cluster headache, activation of the trigeminal vascular system, which means there's a cranial nerve, so a nerve coming from the brainstem, from the brain, which takes care of sensory input from the face and from the meninges, so what surrounds the brain. And this nerve that feeling nerve, feels pain. And this nerve gets extremely activated. And this nerve also touches the blood vessels in the meninges and around here. And this interaction between the two, there's some kind of inflammation going on, or activation, inflammation, that's pain. And then can also happen in migraine, but much more extreme in cluster headache. There's also autonomic activation. So also the pupil can become smaller, eryptosis, hanging the eyelid can hang, the red eye, tearing eye, running nose. And that all together is like the attack itself. And then also people become restless. And that can be because of the pain, or maybe there's something primary going on which makes you restless apart from the brain, which I think the latter, I think it's true. So it's not, so what takes care of the headache? Of course, you also have tension type headache, you have migraine, but we assume that part of migraine and cluster headache have a final common pathway. Just in cluster headache is much more extreme. The autonomic symptoms are much extreme, much more, the pain is extreme. And we have this restlessness, which is not true in migraine at all. And then but it's also peculiar is that it's so strong and sudden. It also lasts relatively short. So every pain is too much. In migraine, it's 1, 2, or 3 days. In cluster headache, it's 15 minutes up to 3 hours. Mostly 1 hour, 1.5, maybe 2. So you can also have more attacks during the day. Comes and goes, which is different than many other headaches.
And the localized pain as well, like cluster.
It's one-sided, like a side-blocked headache, they call it. But still, when I just started doing this work as a doctor, young doctor, people said it was switching all the time. I thought, oh no, that's not cluster headache. I was always thought it's always at the same side. But we know now that it can switch sides, even within one episode, it can switch sides.
Yeah.
And also now, when we do these one-sided treatments, like great occipital nerve injections, it can also switch sides. So the whole thought that there's something broken in one side, something that you could scan and see that is broken, is probably not like that, because it can switch to the other side. So that's a very interesting aspect of the disorder. How can it be that it can switch sides? For the majority of people, it's always the same side. And how is this decided then in this case? Why is it left for you and right for the other person? What's happening there?
This happened to me actually, and then
crazy. But it's observation that it's mostly single-sided, and even some people have bilateral attacks at the same side, but one side is still stronger often than the other. And then I sometimes even wonder, is this the same disease? Are we talking about the same disease? Because more than 95%, I think, even higher, I think, have one-sided attacks.
That predominantly right for me switched to the left.
Okay.
And in some cycles, I know which ones I abort with medication and which ones I ride out.
Okay.
That was in my longest cycle. It was, I think, when I was still right-sided, anything on the left, I would just save the triptan, save whatever, and then only treat the right-sided ones. I have seen people during attacks that have switched as well. Like they're in agonizing pain, and then like moments of relief, and then it switches.
So it's another attack. It's the next. Is it the same attack that's to the other side, or is it a new attack on the other side, or is it just semantics?
Also, there's so many things that I think differ as well, like triggers as well. What do you consider as a trigger for an attack?
We know from the studies that if you give nitric oxides, or active compounds, also CGRP, that's a compound you can give infusions with, you can trigger attacks. People are in bout or chronic. So we know, and alcohol is a famous trigger that patients often discover. So there are mainly vasoactive compounds and alcohol. That's the more, in general, the trigger.
Okay.
And that's strange again, because it doesn't point towards the hypothalamus at all. But maybe it's something in the pathway that you then activate.
Vasoactive is vasodilative.
Yes.
Okay, so that's also then something that oxygen is considered vasoactive, but then it's a treatment.
Yeah, so nobody knows why oxygen works. If it's something with the autonomic nervous system, or the air or the cold air, is it the temperature as well?
Yeah, I'm just glad it works.
Yeah.
Going back to triggers quickly. So is alcohol, maybe not alcohol because there's other, let's say a strong smell. So if I smell something strong, how long after should I have an attack for me to say that strong smell is a trigger?
I know people with migraine have osmophobia, and this is for migraine, it's much more the story that through smells can make pain worse or trigger the migraine even for some. Cluster headache, I don't hear this that often, but I also don't ask it often. So I don't know if it's your experience, but the general question, the time point between a trigger and the attack, what's the maximum time between that you can still say is a trigger? That's not so easy to answer.
Yeah, it's just something that's been on my mind because I think a lot of time it's just about like a predictable management, and of course people are curious about triggers because then they can avoid them.
But mostly people are always seeking for patterns, and often when people think it's a trigger, it's not always really true, I think, because some people say, I always have a migraine if I eat chocolate, for example, but then, you also eat chocolate often, you don't have a migraine.
Yeah.
And there might be something in it, we don't know for sure. Yeah, also be careful that you're always blaming yourself. Every time you have an attack, you blame yourself because you did something wrong or you have this trigger. I don't know many people that really can cure their cluster headache by avoiding a trigger. But I think, in general, alcohol, but what else? Do you have other triggers or other stories from people?
Yeah, I think anything from lying down, relaxing.
Yeah, but that's then, okay, yes.
Yeah,
Can be sleep,
can be weather, of course, weather fronts, barometric pressure, crying, spicy food, things like bacon, but that's proven, of course. Yeah, I've heard of, let's see, what else is, I think these are the most requested ones, or the most, from what we've seen. Personally, for me, I think there have been, so for me, it's always what is being attributed. If I sleep badly, eat something specific, have a cold shower, and then I get a cluster, then I'm always thinking, it's just that time I'm meant to get it.
Yeah.
And how much of it we can attribute to that, versus, I know, alcohol, for example. Have been very specific, identifiable times when I think it was 2 or 3 drinks, and then I would immediately get it. And then lots of times I wouldn't. But eventually I stopped alcohol because it was decision fatigue more than everything, because it's just beer is good, whiskey is bad. So it just gets to a game. But I think it's still useful. The air flight, or taking planes, for example.
Yeah, same story.
For me, the last 3 times I've somehow preempted it to security and boarding time. So by the time I get on the flight, I've already finished my attack, especially on international flights. I don't know how this happened in my last 2 cycles.
Because often it's seen, the lower pressure of the air in the airplane is seen as potentially as a trigger. Like going into the mountains, going skiing during an episode, you get more attacks because of the low air pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, it was in anticipation of the flight.
So that can be, I don't know how that can
But we can, I think that's something that I was thinking about, triggers. So distinction, I know you mentioned this, but some of the key distinctions between migraine and cluster headache.
Yeah, we already raised many of these things, like the sex prevalence. So migraine is more common in women, cluster headache in males, although it's shifting a little bit. The attacks are shorter, much more extreme. The autonomic activation is extreme, and the restlessness is really unique. People with migraine don't want this. If you have a migraine attack, you want to be in the bed without anything affecting you. You want silence, no smell, darkness, no food, especially no loud music. And people with cluster headache, they have the urge to move, they put on loud music, or they do these things, or they go outside in the cold. So that's really different. So if you listen to the story of a person, for me, it's not so difficult to make the distinction, although sometimes cases can be tough. But there's a lot of misdiagnosis in women because of this.
And then my medications are also migraine
medication is partly the
medications.
same. Like sumatriptan is for migraine and for cluster headache. Oxygen works in cluster headache. Then greater occipital nerve injection at least works much more clearly in cluster headache. Acid works, is anti-epileptic drug, works quite and established in migraine and cluster headache, not so clear. Topiramate, other anti-epileptic, works in both. Prednisone works much stronger in cluster headache, not really used in migraine, and so I can go on. So part of it is the same, part of it is different. We don't understand it, in fact, and it can be very frustrating, but it's also, of course, interesting. So it's a really different disorder with some shared commonalities. Also, some genes are shared, some aspects probably of the blood vessels and pathways are shared. But for example, the newer treatments for migraine, the CGRP antibodies, they're newer, just new level treatments for migraine. They don't work that clearly in cluster headache yet. Still some studies, but it's not extremely clear that they work so well. So it's also different again.
Yeah, it's only been approved in one country for episodics.
Yeah.
And then now there's evidence for, of course, PACAP and developments.
Those are the new ones. And I'm looking forward to see this, because I really do hope that there will be something better than we have now. Because it's nice, like the population of people with cluster headache that I see, they're nice. I like seeing them. I think it's really nice also to find, many of them are interested also in these things you're interested in. But I wish we had something better as a treatment. I know we made some progress with nerve blocks, and I'm extremely glad that we can give oxygen and sumatriptan injections. But the question is, especially for chronic, if we can find a cause, which we don't know, maybe we can treat it in a more causal way. Yeah.
And
without all these side effects.
You mentioned a lot of drugs. One of the most common drugs that gets mentioned, not in a good way, especially, maybe not here, but I'm talking globally, is paracetamol, of course, for headaches. So let's imagine if you had cluster headaches and you went to someone and they said, take a paracetamol, what would you tell them?
No. Because one thing, it doesn't work fast enough. If you have an attack and it will last 1 or 2 hours, even if you take a pill of sumatriptan, it's often too slow. So that's why we inject it, or maybe nasal spray. So paracetamol, maybe preventive then. I think it's just People say it takes off the sharp edges of the pain, maybe a little. It's also just a painkiller. But for cluster headache, what I said, it's so severe, it's so extreme. Paracetamol will not work. And we also know that if you take paracetamol too often, it can have the side effect of chronic daily headache, or like a medication overuse headache, it's called. And sometimes people have a lot of headache between the cluster headache attacks, and then they don't even mention it because I also don't ask it, but I know I have to ask it. But do you take other painkillers then? Yes, I used to use paracetamol every day. And then they stop the paracetamol, and then the persistent headache goes away, and they only have the cluster headache attacks left, for some at least. So it's just not good to use paracetamol every day. In general, it's not good to use it every day for headache.
And it does nothing for cluster headache.
And it does do, no, exactly. No, it's not, I wouldn't advise that.
Should we study more episodic people? I know a lot of times there's studies with chronic, of course. I think from study design point of view, I get you don't.
You can also blame me for this because most studies we run are in chronic. And why is that? Exactly what you say. It's much more easy in a logistic way to perform the study because people have attacks throughout the year. You can include them throughout the year. And if you want to study episodic, the timing of when you measure is so important because it will come and it will go without any intervention. So it's just a challenge to have people at the beginning of the episode, and then even if you have a baseline period, then after the baseline, some people already on the return of the bout will improve by itself. So a huge placebo effects in these studies, but it's not only placebo, it's also natural disease course. Bout will also improve by itself. So if you want to show that a medication or preventive thing is better than placebo, it's really difficult. People try and have tried, and I think we should try it even maybe more. Same as the study we're now doing with mini-dosing LSD, we do it in chronic. Yeah, of course, I hope if we show it works in chronic, it will also work in episodic. But then the study would have been so complex to perform with so many challenges. That's where we choose the most difficult group. And what's also, if you look at the literature, most studies in chronic are negative. And in episodic, you do have some positive studies.
Because it gets better, right?
And maybe because some people say, oh, there are two different disorders, episodic, chronic are different. But I don't know about that because people can become chronic and then they're episodic. Or you can change between the two. The cutoff of 3 months is just what we came up with. It's not biological cutoff, it's just an agreement. I think maybe if we study chronic too much, we study the most difficult to treat cases, and then it's much more difficult to find an effect because you're looking in the most severely affected group. And maybe in episodic, it's a little bit easier to treat. Maybe we should study things there. But on the other hand, for episodic, we do have other options. We have the nerve blocks, we have prednisone, we have verapamil. So there are already quite a few things you can do in episodic, and for chronic, it's much more limited. So we also need things in chronic.
Should it be categorized as a rare disease, chronic cluster headache?
That's a good point. For many, if it's a rare disease, officially, it opens up much more possibilities. Funding for research, mainly that.
Faster approval for drugs.
Exactly. And then you have to call it two separate disorders. So in that way, it would be good. But thinking about pathophysiology, I think it's much more continuum. But then if you combine episodic and chronic, it's officially not rare, because then it's 1 in 1,000. And for rare, it has to be, what is it?
2,500, I think.
It's 50, before I say it wrong, 50 in 1,000? Something like this.
Is it? Okay.
I don't know. Let pinpoint this to me, but it's not rare enough. So in a way, for regulatory reasons, funding, maybe we should keep chronic. And indeed, for chronic, we do, which we don't do for episodic at the moment. And yeah, that's so. There are arguments for both sides.
Yeah, I was just more excited by the funding for research and faster drug approvals. Yeah. Can you tell us, we'll start wrapping up now, I'm mindful of your time. Can you tell us about some of the research? Of course, you mentioned siesta.
Yeah, so what are we doing? Let's see. I'm very proud of the people I work with here. Many PhD students that are training to, they're already doctors, want to be neurologists, or some of them are more like technical or like lab people. And they all have this passion to try to solve cluster headache, but it's not easy. And we're happy with all the support and ideas. One part is more fundamental, like looking at hypothalamus, sleep, clock, hormones, rhythms, trying to find the cause, which is challenging. And I wish we could do more of this. Also some new imaging studies perhaps, but it's very costly. And if you go for funding, the agencies tend to fund things with immediate effect. So treatment studies, and that's the other part we do, treatment studies. So the nerve blocks, that's just one of the things we finished. And now we're running the mini LSD trial together with Nijmegen. And then of course, you can sell it. If it's successful, we have a new treatment. So then the people are likely to fund it. Still, funding is really a challenge for such a disorder which is not so well known or popular in a way. Yeah, we're trying to work, and another part we do is just characterizing the disease. Like some people that help us, and we send out like questions to people. Like one of the recent projects was, when did it start for you? When did it end for you? You can describe the disease course during the lifetime of many cases. So we can also help people by showing this is what it was for most people. Help doctors to understand it. Those are also studies we do. But I can go on. We do many things. One of the new projects we're doing now is for shadow headaches, interictal headache. What's shadow headache?
Nice. Okay.
That's the thing we're doing now. And then the next step will be this study where we try to affect sleep, improve sleep, and improve cluster headache. That's the next thing.
Okay.
But I still
That's
getting
sunset.
it started. That's sunset.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're well. So yeah,
I'm keeping that.
and we just launched the website. We just launched it. And there we also give an overview of all the studies that were finished, studies that are coming, and you can also ask the questions there or apply for the studies. So we're trying, and also internationally, we're trying to build a better network. There are a few really great research groups and nice people, but it's a small field, cluster headache. And then I think it's nice if we join forces from people all over the world that are interested. Yeah. That's also very good what you were doing. You're trying to build this network on the patient side. That's great. So I hope we can together, it sounds really like together, but I really think so. We need people that want to join our studies, cluster headache, also control. Yeah, so I hope we can find the cause and then a better cure.
What do you think is the key? This is another question I ask everyone. If there was a research genie, of course, then genie can give you a cure, but I don't think that gives us answers to think about. But what is one wish you could ask for? It's a research genie, but what would you wish for? That is not a cure or funds, because then
I wonder what the other people said. I would like that the small clue, like the secret little clue, or where to look.
Okay.
So I think because we're just looking at the wrong place at the wrong way. Like, I hope maybe it's hypothalamus, and we're pursuing that, of course. But I would love to have this little secret from some entity, like you should look in this part of the brain or of the body, or there you should look. And then I would love to look there and find out together with other people actually causing it. That would be great.
Yeah, that does sound great, actually.
Because that's the key, I think, that we don't know where to look. We don't understand the disorder at all, to be honest. We know many things, but Karen and us, like the core of the disease, why in this person, what was actually wrong. I would love to find out what that is.
It is, again, as agonizing, as debilitating as it is, one of the factors for me. It's also fascinating to understand how different parts interact. Like you said, there's the involvement of the hypothalamus, which is such a small organ. There is the circadian rhythms, the circannual rhythms, the pathophysiology, but different presentations between episodic, chronic, the number of different types of drugs that work, from calcium channel blockers, anticonvulsants.
And they're all discovered by coincidence. It's not because we thought it's just coincidence that we figured out they work.
And you want to think, right, that there is something central, there is some spider that has put the web, that we found all the peripheral items and then we want to go back.
Exactly.
I think on that note, it's a good time to end. Okay. And thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. And see you next time.